Welcome back, everyone, to our final presentation before we go to our general panel discussion in this afternoon's proceedings. Ashwini Deshpande is going to speak to us. She teaches at the Delhi School of Economics in India and is the winner of the VKRV Rao Award for Indian economists under 45. And the EXIM Bank Award for the most outstanding dissertation. Her PhD in early publications focused on the international debt crisis of the 1980s. Subsequently, she has been working on the economics of discrimination and affirmative action issues with a focus on caste and gender in India. And so it's no accident we have asked her to come and talk to us because many of our faculty are very concerned with those very issues. And she's also been working on aspects of the Chinese economy. She has published extensively, edited and co-edited several books, such as Boundaries of Clan and Color, Transnational Studies of Intergroup Disparity, Globalization and Development, a Handbook of New Perspectives, and her forthcoming book is Grammar of Caste, Economic Discrimination in Contemporary India. She's going to address us today on that very subject, the grammar of caste and economic discrimination. Please, Ashwini.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to the center and for this symposium. I'm very honored to be here. I'm not going to give a summary of my forthcoming book, which the title of which is the same as the title of my talk today. But I'm going to just focus on some of the issues that are related to empirical studies of discrimination, and really going to focus a little bit on caste discrimination and what some of the recent evidence has uncovered. Now, the problem here that these studies try to look at is too well known for me to repeat, but I still have them in bullet points. Which is basically the ex-untouchable Jati is a name for caste, and so these are these ex-untouchable castes, also known as Dalits, which literally means the oppressed. So the word Dalit is a term of pride that these castes use in order to describe themselves, and so they are subjected to deprivation, discrimination, oppression, violence, exclusion, and a stigmatized ethnic identity that manifests itself in a variety of fields. The interesting thing is that even though the natural category to which people say that they would belong is a jati, but we don't actually have data by jati. So the last jati-based census was in 1931. And this time round, there's some talk of introducing the measurement of caste in the census, which could be a whole separate talk. So I will not enter into that question at all about all the pros and cons associated with that issue. But the fact remains that we don't really have a data based upon jati. And so basically the kind of data that are available on the measurement of caste disparities and discrimination are dictated by the needs of the affirmative action policy. And for the purposes of affirmative action, a group of jatis is clubbed together in an omnibus category called scheduled castes, only because they appear in a government schedule. That's the only reason that they are called scheduled castes, and these are all the Dalit jatis. And similarly, tribes have been identified and put in a government schedule, and therefore they're called scheduled tribes. And until the mid-1990s, basically it was just these three categories in terms of data, I'm saying. One is the scheduled castes, the other were the scheduled tribes, and everybody else who was neither a scheduled caste nor a scheduled tribe. So the term SC/ST, the scheduled caste tribe, is a very official category. That's the official terminology because the data are available in terms of these categories, SC and ST. And so till the mid-1990s, you really had three broad groups. And the category others was really anybody who was neither a scheduled caste nor a scheduled tribe. So it's not a natural category. I mean, nobody will say I am an other. It's basically what it means is I'm not an SC, I'm not an ST. It's by elimination. So everybody who is neither an SC nor an ST becomes an other. That's because the census does not count the jatis. And if you're applying, for example, for admission to a university where there would be quotas for SC and ST. So if you were an SC or an ST And if you wanted to take advantage of the affirmative action policy, you would tick a little box saying, I'm SC or ST, whatever. And if you didn't tick that box, you would be other. So that's how the data were available. In the mid 1990s, as a result of an older issue that was pending, which related to jatis who were not untouchable, and so therefore they were not scheduled castes, but they were in principle fairly low enough in the hierarchy to be also extremely deprived, not stigmatized in the same way as the untouchables were, but certainly deprived. And so there was this notion of other backward castes. So these are, in principle, these are supposed to be jatis that are fairly low in social and economic hierarchy. Now, in practice, the making of the OBC list could be yet another talk that one could have. So I'm not really going into the question of how the OBC list got made, but the principle on which the OBC category got formed was basically to recognize that the jati system or the caste system is a system of graded inequality rather than a 0-1 kind of a thing. So either you're an untouchable or you're not. That's not really the correct way to look at the caste system. So you think of it as a graded inequality. And so the idea was to recognize a group who were not untouchables and therefore not stigmatized by the stigma of untouchability, but were fairly low in the hierarchy. And so a group called OBCs has been talked about, actually since the time of the British. It's not a new invention at all. But finally, in the mid-1990s, affirmative action was extended to include the group of OBCs. Now, the making of the OBC list is another story, and we won't go into that. But the interesting thing is that the group of OBCs got, affirmative action got extended to the OBCs, but it's a group that the Indian census does not count. So it's probably the only instance of affirmative action in the world for a target population that is not recognized and counted by the census. And so the only estimates of OBCs that we have are from the National Sample Survey. Also from some of the other survey data, but the National Sample Survey is the biggest national survey after the Indian census, which is of course a census of the entire population. And so the estimates of OBC, from the latest round of the NSS, for example, is and this is self-reported. These are people who report themselves to be OBC. So it's 43% rural and 34% urban report themselves to be OBCs. And so now the others category. So all the data sets after the mid-1990s have now 4 categories: SC, ST, OBC, and others. And the others category now is a sum of, the others category earlier, before the mid-1990s, is a sum of the new others and the OBCs. Basically, that's what it is. So the earlier others is now split into 2, the OBCs and the others. And so this new others category is a rough approximation of the upper castes. It's not necessarily the upper caste, but it's conventionally. So when you hear in data, when in empirical work, when you hear the word upper caste, it's very rarely the case that you're actually sampling only the upper caste. It's usually everyone who's not SC, ST, and OBC. So that's just a kind of a statutory explanation of the data. Now, in terms of disparities, I've done work with NSS data, with NFHS, the National Family and Health Survey data, which is the DHS data for India, and I've documented disparities, and a lot of it is also in the forthcoming books. I'm not going to spend time on the disparities part of the story. I really want to talk a little bit about discrimination, especially in urban labor markets, because I think the way in which discrimination takes place in rural and more traditional caste-based occupations is fairly well known. And the real mystery is how it manifests itself in urban scenarios and in occupations that are not caste-based at all. These are modern occupations associated with the modern economy, and these occupations are not caste-based, and anybody and everybody could be free to choose whichever occupation they wanted to choose. And so the question is, how do you see then outcomes still stratified by caste? And that's really that's really one of the questions that I've been looking at, and I would like to share some of the work that I've done on that. Now, of course, India is not unique in terms of labor market discrimination. Tendency for labor markets to discriminate is global, and you see discrimination by race, gender, religion, ethnic identity in pretty much all economies and societies. And for example, one of the starting points for even wanting to examine the phenomenon of discrimination in terms of caste is if you look at, for example, the NSS data, and if you look at average wages of SCs and average wages for non-SCs, you find a difference even when you control, for example, for education. So within an educational category, you'll find average wages differ. Within urban residents, you'll find, so basically when you control for similar characteristics, you still find a difference in average wages. And that's the puzzle, because if people are differently educated and therefore they earn different wages, that's not a surprise. And that necessarily does not reflect discrimination, right? This could just be a reward to your skill or education level. But when you find average wages to be different after controlling for these characteristics, that's really the puzzle that one is trying to explore. Now, the real question, one of the arguments that has come up in the literature is that there is no contemporary discrimination. What this is reflecting is that there was past discrimination, and this is an argument also made in the context of the United States, that it's really what we are seeing today are the effects of past discrimination. So it is true that certain groups were stigmatized and heavily discriminated against in the past, and that is what results in differential outcomes today because of just this legacy of being excluded and being oppressed and being stigmatized, etc. But there is no mechanism for labor markets to replicate discrimination in the present. So that's one of the arguments. And really the question is to see whether that's indeed holds or not. And the other argument that one hears in the literature is that, yes, of course there's discrimination, but that's typically for caste-based occupations, that certain castes, for example, an untouchable, an untouchable, if he wanted to become a priest in a temple, there would be huge resistance to that. So that's an example of discrimination, because if he could acquire the knowledge of the scriptures, why should he not be allowed to become a priest? But so you find discrimination in traditional caste-based occupations, but not necessarily in modern occupations that are not caste-based. So these are the kinds of arguments in the literature, and the question is to see to what extent do these arguments hold, and to what extent are they valid. And one of the techniques that economists use is what is called the decomposition technique. And so without going into the details of it, basically what you're trying to do is you're looking at the gap in average wages, and you're trying to then artificially decompose that gap into the proportion of the gap that's explained by characteristics. And by characteristics, you take into account all the possible wage earning characteristics. So you take into account the place of residence, your age, for example, your fluency in English. We all know about the importance of English in India, and the first talk, in fact, referred to that, very categorically. And it's true that if you're fluent in English, there is a premium that one commands in the labor market. And so basically you control for all kinds of characteristics that would explain why you might earn a higher wage. And so that's the proportion of the wage gap that's called the explained wage gap. So that's explained by characteristics. And the other, but then you also find that a part of the wage gap remains even after you control for all the possible wage earning characteristics. And that is the residual, or that is the unexplained part. And that is typically taken to be a measure of discrimination, because it should not, all the gaps should disappear once you account for for all the wage earning characteristics. Now, of course, this is just one technique, and there are both pros and cons of all of these techniques that I'm going to talk about. But however, this is a very well-established technique used by labor economists, and so there are studies done, using this technique also for India. Now, what you find when you try to apply this technique to the NSS data, what one finds as a first observation is that if you look at SCs and non-SCs, there is what is called a high endowment difference, which means that if you just take the average level of characteristics of Dalits, of scheduled castes, and the average level of characteristics of the non-Dalits, there's a huge gap. So non-Dalits typically tend to be more educated, have higher skill levels, greater fluency in English, and all the rest of it. All right, so a lot of the difference in average wages is explained actually by what is called the high endowment difference. And in the literature, this is known as pre-market discrimination, because these are all characteristics that individuals have acquired before they entered the labor market. And the idea is here, the argument here is that the acquisition of these characteristics, the fact that I could go to an English medium private school as opposed to somebody else who could not, that already signals a discriminatory process, but it's a discrimination that's happening in society before individuals enter the labor market. So this is not strictly speaking labor market discrimination. This discrimination has already occurred. And so by the time individuals reach the labor market, they are differentially endowed. There is already a gap, right? And so the NSS data confirms that. So you look at any level of, you take any characteristic, and you'll find a big gap between the SCs and the non-SCs in terms of any of the characteristics. And that, in fact, accounts for a large degree of, the differential wage gap. But the interesting thing is that if you just look at the urban population, then the endowment difference between SCs and non-SCs, especially in terms of education and skill acquisition, has actually been narrowing since the mid-1980s, possibly as a result of affirmative action. So greater number of Dalits are coming into education. And so you find endowment differences which are high, but have been narrowing. So that's in fact a result of, it's possibly a result of affirmative action. There's no empirical work to suggest that, we don't know how to disentangle that, but it's possibly a result of affirmative action. So looking at 20 years of data based upon NSS, results based upon NSS data, one of the interesting things is, despite the fact that endowment differences have been narrowing, if you look at what labor economists define as returns to education, which means that if you have a particular degree, how is the labor market going to reward it? And so what turns out is that SC/ST groups have a lower return to education as compared to the non-SC/ST groups in the labor market. And this is based upon regressions using, wage equations, etc. Again, if there are questions on about these techniques, I'm happy to talk about them later. But at the moment, I'm just giving you the results. And this has been examined for each level of education. And you, in fact, find that the rate of return to education for SC/ST groups at each level of education is declining. So in order to earn the same return, they have to go one notch above. So, for example, earlier, if you were just if you had finished high school, now in order to earn the same rate of return that you would have got in the labor market as being a high school graduate, you would now need to study at least a couple of years more in order to get the same return. And so that again signals labor market discrimination.
That is not coming through the non-SC.
It's not happening to the non-SC/ST. In fact, for non-SC/ST, the premium is rising. So every additional year of education adds.
This is what you would expect.
That should happen, yeah. So as levels of education go up, the idea is that return, yeah. So, but that's happening for the non-SC/ST groups, but not for the SC/ST groups. Now, as I said before, a large part of the earnings gap is due to endowment differences. And what I want to emphasize is that this endowment difference already encompasses discrimination before the individuals have entered the labor market. So what you're estimating as the discriminatory gap in the labor market is actually an underestimation of overall economic discrimination, because individuals have already come to the labor market having embodying these endowment differences, which in turn are due to social discrimination, but that the labor market, so labor market cannot be blamed for that level of discrimination. So a large part of the wage gap is in fact due to endowment differences. But the interesting thing is that as much as 20% of the wage gap is still due to so after you control for all the endowment variables, you still have 20% of the wage gap that cannot be explained. Now that is something that would be considered pretty high, given the fact that you've tried to control for every possible thing, including sector, industry, etc., urban residents, and all of that. I will probably skip this bullet because I'll have to now explain the technique of how you calculate overpayment and underpayment. So this technique also allows you to think of what might be called a non-discriminatory rate of return. And using that non-discriminatory rate of return, it allows you to calculate how certain groups might be overpaid. So they get paid more than what a non-discriminatory labor market would have paid with the same educational characteristics, and certain groups get underpaid. So that's a refinement of this technique, and this is used for the United States and many other countries. And anyhow, so just take it from me at the moment that you can calculate underpayment and overpayment in this manner, and in fact you find that there is an underpayment to SCs. And that actually confirms the low returns to education point, as much as 13%. So basically the point is that even when one of the constant piece of advice that groups such as untouchables are given is that just improve your education levels and all will be well. The fact is, even if they improve their education levels, the question is, will the labor market reward higher educational acquisition adequately? That's the question really. And here it seems to suggest that just improving education levels is not sufficient, because there are discriminatory tendencies within the labor market. So even if they acquired higher education, they would be discriminated against. This technique also allows you to identify what is called job discrimination versus what is called wage discrimination. And just explaining this briefly, job discrimination is when two people earn different wages because they are concentrated at different spectrums, different ends of the occupational spectrum. So for example, if I become a sweeper versus if I become a computer scientist, I would, these two occupations would earn different wages because they happen to be concentrated at two different ends of the spectrum. So that's called job discrimination. So is it the case that certain groups disproportionately tend to congregate at the lower ends of the occupational spectrum, and certain groups disproportionately tend to congregate at the higher ends of the occupational spectrum? That is job discrimination. And wage discrimination, that's more seen in the case of gender discrimination, where men and women get paid differently for exactly the same job. And this again happens not only in India, but practically in all labor markets, where for exactly the same job, men and women are paid differently. And often even governments have different standards of minimum wages for exactly the same job description for men and women. And so that is called wage discrimination. So you're basically doing the same job, but you get paid differently. Now for Dalits, it's actually occupational segregation that explains a larger part of this overall discrimination. So if you further decompose the first set of decomposition, you can go further down and you can say, so basically what's happening is that in the spectrum of modern occupations that are not at all what's happening is that Dalits are tending to get concentrated at the lower ends of the modern occupational spectrum, and the non-Dalits are tending to get concentrated at the higher ends of the modern occupational spectrum. And that's really occupational, that's called job discrimination. And that is really what is explaining this kind of labor market discrimination. So again, the question here is that this is after controlling for education. All of these results are after controlling for education. So the question is, of course, they have to acquire more education. But I think what needs to be done is something more. And that is something that, so you have to have very strong anti-discriminatory policies within the labor market, because just simply acquisition of education obviously doesn't eliminate the problem. It's really, these are people in urban India, in formal sector jobs, some in informal, but also in formal sector jobs. These are educated individuals that, these results are all based on educated individuals. And so it's not really the question of the fact that you're earning differential wages because you're illiterate. These are educated people, and you still have this gap. There's another technique that's used, especially in the United States, very often, which are called correspondence studies, and I'm going to just talk about the application of this technique for India. And there's a paper by Thorat and Atterwell. What they did was they responded to newspaper advertisements in English language newspapers for entry or near entry level positions. So these were only in English language newspapers. So you're already controlling for people, for fluency in English is already controlled for here. So it's really the top end of the labor market that you are, even though these jobs themselves were entry level positions, but by the fact that they were newspapers in Delhi, in English language newspapers, and in media channels, advertising companies, etc., etc. So if you look at the overall spectrum of occupations, they come fairly at the top of the occupation, and they sampled a wide variety of firms. And what basically they did was prepared fake resumes and used only male applicants to not have gender effects complicate the story, only to isolate the effect of caste and religion. And basically they used very easily identifiable stereotypical last names. And there were three groups that they represented. One was a Hindu upper caste name, the other was a Muslim, and the third was a Dalit. And the names were such that anybody would have, not all names are easily recognizable, I have to emphasize, but some names are. And so they use very stereotypical names, which practically anybody who's familiar with India would be able to recognize. And they sent absolutely identical resumes, because One of the issues that also gets raised in the literature is it's not a question of an identical degree. It's also which school you went to, all right? But if you show that a Dalit and a Muslim and a Hindu upper caste went to exactly the same school, they got exactly the same division of marks, then it's also you're controlling for quality of education as well. And so these resumes were exactly identical except for the names. And these studies have also been done in a variety of international contexts. So, but I'm just reporting to you the results of the study in India. And basically they find that the Dalit odds of a successful response are 2/3 that of an upper caste. So they are 2/3 less likely to get called. And these were just applications placed for, and the response that was looked at was callback. So it's not, these were not job offers. All right. The question is, you leave your telephone number, and does the company call you back and ask you to come for an interview? That's it. They don't actually go for the interview because these individuals don't exist. These are fake resumes. But the question is, do you get a letter in the mail asking you to appear for an interview? That's all. So these are people that these companies have not seen. So there's no personality issues. It's not as though the upper caste were all, had, these dashing personalities and so everybody swooned. It wasn't that. Basically, these are just names on a piece of paper. And the question is, will they be called back for an interview? That's it. And once they were called back, of course, nobody went for the interview because there were no individuals backing these applications. And so these are just odds of getting a call back from the company, just indicating an interest to meet. That's it. Not promise of a job. That's a further step. And for a Muslim, in fact, it was 0.33, which is really a really low response rate as compared to an Hindu upper caste. And this is again English language, that all the jobs required fluency in English, and all the applicants had on paper the requisite fluency in English. Because basically there were units of 3 that was mailed to these companies, and they did like 12,000 or something. So it was a very large number. So it could not, and they kept on replicating these applications to make sure that they would not, that it wasn't a small sample kind of an issue. And subsequently, there's been another study in the region of Chennai. This was for Delhi. Subsequently, there's a recent paper which has been a study of Chennai, where this person, Zahra Siddiq, she also introduces gender into the picture. And so she looks at both gender and caste and how that affects the callback offers. And in fact, she finds that a low caste female applicant has the lowest probability of callback. So if you're Dalit and a woman, that's you have the double stigma of this thing. And so the callbacks are actually lowest for this particular group. And again, I can go into the details of the study, but this is just to introduce you to, yes.
Do her findings replicate the Thorat study?
Yes. No, but except that in her case, it's also gender, right? So in their case, it was only caste because they only use male applicants. So they are not strictly comparable, but what they do confirm is that if the difference between Dalit and so for example, within women, the difference between Dalit and upper caste is significant, and within men, the difference between Dalit and upper caste is significant. But if you take all 4 groups, Dalit men, Dalit women, upper caste men, upper caste women, then in fact, Dalit women have the lowest probability of callback. That's her study. Now, I did a study which was a college to work study. This was a kind of a larger project done by Princeton University, which consisted of 4 different studies trying to uncover patterns of urban labor market discrimination. Not Zahra Siddiq's paper, that was subsequent. But so the first study that I talked about, the Decomposition study, then the Thorat and Attawell paper of Correspondence, and my paper, and another one that I'm going to talk about that looks at the other side of the labor market. These 4 papers were a part of a larger urban labor market study, trying to understand how discrimination manifests itself in urban labor markets. And one of the things that I'm sure everybody who's familiar with India knows that caste is very difficult to identify by just looking at a person. So you can't guess what caste I belong to, and neither can you guess the caste of any Indian sitting here. And so the question is, when it's difficult to identify in a visual manner, especially in urban labor markets that predominantly deal with occupations that are not caste-based. And so urban labor markets are supposed to be anonymous. But when you look at the outcomes in urban labor markets, they don't seem to be all that anonymous. In other words, you find a very systematic difference between caste groups. So the real puzzle is, in this system of anonymity, and especially in the private sector where you're not supposed to disclose your caste, because the only time that you disclose whether you're an SC or an ST, is when you take advantage of the affirmative action policy, and that doesn't apply to the private sector. So if you're applying for a private sector job, nobody should be able to tell what caste you belong to on paper. On paper, your caste is anonymous, but on the ground, when you look at the outcomes, they don't seem to be all that difficult to discern. And so the real question is to find out how employers determine the caste of. So our study was basically done. It's a college to work study. So what we did was we took a sample of students from Delhi University, Jawaharlal, the three universities in Delhi that by all, within the Indian higher educational system would be regarded as probably one of the three of the finest universities in India. So this is, what is called a highly creamed sample, which is the creamy layer of the Indian society. These are the sample and so we find, in fact, in our sample that 28% of our sample were the students who got in through affirmative action, who got in through reservation, which is a much higher proportion that you would find normally in an institution, because it's only supposed to be 22.5. But the reason we find this high, partly we tried to make sure that we had, in fact, a sufficient representation of Dalit students in our group, but also it represents the creamed nature of our sample. And so what we tried to do is we interviewed these students when they were in their last semester of their program, and when they were on the eve of their entry into the labor market. And we administered a baseline questionnaire, and we asked them questions about what were their aspirations, what were the kinds of jobs they expected to find, what was the ideal job. So we asked them two questions about the ideal job. What was the job that you realistically expected to find? What do you think would be the time during which you'll find the job that you realistically expect to find? What is, how will you actually find the job that you'll get in the labor market, etc.? What is the expected salary? And all these kinds of questions. So this was like a baseline questionnaire. And we followed this group of students over 2 years. And we interviewed them every 6 months in order to track their progress and to see how many of them had got jobs and through what way. And then we compared their outcomes to what they had initially said in their baseline question. This was the nature of the study. And again, it's a very large study, and I don't have the time to go into all the details because I want to share some other work.
What was the sample size of the
183. We had 183 students across 3 universities, and we tried to control for subject. So, for example, if you took economics students, so we tried to take, so obviously you can't have half of Dalits and non-Dalits because that's not the proportion. But we basically tried to, so supposing we had 7 Dalits from economics, then we made sure that we at least had 10 non-Dalits from, so basically we also tried to control for subject because the expected salaries economists typically tend to earn much more in the labor market than historians would tend to do. So we controlled for that. So we did control for subject, and so I'm not going into all the details of the methodology, but basically we tried to we balanced out the ideal salary in terms of their disciplinary background, etc. Anyway, to flag again some of the salient results from this study, the likelihood of non-Dalit students of being employed in family-owned businesses using family connections to find a job was much higher, because we asked them a question about will you use your family connections or relatives or friends in order to find a job, and they had to answer yes or no. And so we find, in fact, that the probability that non-Dalits will use family networks or connections was much higher than Dalits. And we found ample evidence of what I have referred to earlier as the pre-market discrimination. So, for example, Dalits talked about access to education in a variety of ways. So cost was an issue, especially for higher education when they had to go to a college. In order to pay for private colleges, cost was an issue. Distance was an issue. So to get to a decent college, they often had to travel a long distance from their villages. That was an issue. The other was just the stigma of being Dalit. And when their teachers found out that they were actually Dalit, they recounted stories of what happened within classrooms, indirect references to their names, or just a kind of a discriminatory treatment within classrooms, etc. So there are all of these issues associated with, especially with middle level and higher level education. Then, of course, the quality of education, there's no comparison between the quality of education that Dalits, on average, tend to get with what non-Dalits tend to get. And Dalits tend to get poorer quality education. Lack of fluency in English is, of course, one of the, but lack of fluency, for example, in maths is another very big impediment when it comes to the labor market, because they have very, very poor skills in mathematics just because they haven't had the training. So poor quality of education. A lot of them talked about being asked to pay bribes or donations to colleges for which they did not have the money. They would have gladly paid them if they could afford to. But the question of affordability of being able to pay, and all of these factors militate against Dalits. So the pre-market discrimination is adequately, we have ample evidence to establish pre-market discrimination. Now we asked them about when, and so most of these people applied for private sector jobs. Most of these are private sector. Some of them also applied for teaching positions. So we have some of those interviews as well. But what I'm sharing with you today is what they faced in private sector jobs when they applied for interviews. So the Dalits typically had perceptions of a wired interview. They got the feeling that when they entered the interview room, it was already clear that they were not going to get the job. They felt that they were not interviewed seriously enough, and that they were just interviewed because they had to be interviewed for some reason, and that they felt that the job was already, that's the feeling they got, that they were not serious candidates. And they could tell that by a whole range of, we have lots and lots of interview data here, but the way in which the interview panel responded to them, and the reason when we asked them so basically their explanation to that phenomenon was that they lacked what is called in Indian English pull. We don't have the pull, which means that they believed that they lacked a network of influential supporters, that they lacked the network necessary to place them in a favorable light in the labor market, which they believed that non-Dalits had. Often we found that in private sector jobs where affirmative action does not apply, they were put on the defensive by being asked to defend the affirmative action or the quota policy in a private firm where affirmative action does not apply. And that question about affirmative action, really speaking, has no place in a job for a private sector interview. But often they were asked to defend, their views about the private sector, about the quota policy. And of course they would say, well, it's a good thing, we support the quota policy. And then immediately they would be attacked for supporting the quota policy. Now, how the employers found out, I'm just going to come to that in a moment. But this was a question, and they felt that this question had no place in the interview, because it would not, whatever their private views were about the quota policy, had no bearing on the job for which they were applying. And we also, within the Dalit community, we also found a difference in terms of the relatively richer Dalits versus the relatively poorer Dalits, where the poorer Dalits found, just traveling to places in order to go for interviews was a bit prohibitive because of the cost and the logistics of going and for the interviews, etc. So there were some of these issues. Now, we asked them also about their views on the affirmative action policy. We said, what do you think of the quota policy? Do you think it's a good thing? Do you think we should have it? And all of them unanimously amongst the Dalit students, I'll come to the non-Dalit interviews as well, all of them amongst the Dalits believed that reservations or the quota policy was critical. They believed that without reservations, they would not have had a chance to obtain the higher degree for which they were studying when we interviewed them. So they were all there because of the quota policy, and they believed that was absolutely essential for them to be there. To use some of their quotations, for example, they said that it enabled them to open their mouths, to go to the center of society where they meet other people and get a platform. And so it was clear that they felt that the silence that was imposed by just prejudice, atrocity, poverty, etc. All of that was broken because of the fact that they got higher education as a result of the affirmative action policy. So they were very strong defenders. 4 minutes? Okay. And there was, of course, shrinking of the fear. Now, I'm just going to conclude by explaining how the employers actually found out. Now, virtually all the respondents were asked about family backgrounds during job interviews in large private sector companies, including in multinational companies. So the first question is, what is your family background? And so basically, the non-Dalits rarely saw this question as offensive because they had family backgrounds to be proud of. So they had, very comfortable middle-class family backgrounds, and they would happily tell the interviewers that their father was such and such, their mother was this and that and the other, and so they were proud of their family backgrounds. But Dalits, in fact, found this question prying or offensive. And often Dalits with non-familiar last names, surnames that the interview panel had not heard about, were asked about what is your caste? a question again which has no place in the interview. And the feeling was that this question was asked not with a view to help them. So again, a quotation from one of they asked me about my parents, what they do. So I said they own a small bit of land, they are farmers, but they do small business. I got the feeling that I was being singled out for these kinds of questions. I later asked some other boys who they were, and they said they had not been asked. The psychological effect of these questions is very negative. Supposing you get selected, even after that, you'll remain conscious because the person will know about your family background and try to exploit you, etc. Just one more quotation. I was asked about the family background, but I did not tell them the reality. We actually are 6 brothers and sisters, but I actually told them that I just have 1 brother and 1 sister. They asked me, what is your father? I told them he's a teacher. He was not a teacher, actually. He was an agricultural worker. But he just felt that if he said he was a teacher with a small family, then it presents the view of a middle-class family, which would then help him. The other side of the fence is the non-Dalit students. And basically, of course, there are jobs, the Indian growth story is well known. There are good jobs growing, etc. But there's also high competition. And non-Dalits reported a far more favorable interview and selection procedure and a far more positive interpretive disposition. That means that whatever they were asked, they interpreted much more favorably than the Dalits did. Of course, they have greater fluency in English, confidence in academic skills, greater cultural capital. However, we asked them this question: do you see yourself privileged? They said no. Every single one of them said that we don't think we are privileged in society. In fact, they believe that the Dalits were privileged because they got the affirmative action policy. Anyway, so so basically it's the family background question that is really the key. How employers in a private sector firm find out what the caste or religious background, and this is confirmed by the 4th study, which was also done, which was an employer attitude survey. And so basically the same questions were asked also to employers to ask them about, what do you look for when you interview candidates? And they said, of course, merit. So everybody voices a commitment for merit, but there's a very strong belief about how this merit is distributed. And the belief is that the merit is distributed by regional lines, so there are regional stereotypes, there are religious stereotypes, and there are caste stereotypes. And so even though there's an unequivocal commitment to merit, and we want the best person for the job, but who is the best? And that's really the question. And so basically, what you find is that role networks and who you know matters much more in the private sector than really what you know. So the belief, the way merit is defined is actually is a very complex phenomenon, and that's how you really find in urban labor markets with modern jobs in the private sector, you find discrimination perpetuating itself, and traditionally marginalized groups. In fact, it's not at all clear that if they only acquired education, would actually be able to break this discriminatory barrier unless there's a very strong anti-discriminatory mechanism in place, which includes many things which I don't have the time to go. I have them on the slide, but I don't have the time to go into right now. But basically, there are many more things that need to be done in addition to acquisition of education in order to break this discriminatory pattern. Thank you.
Hi. Okay. Hi, I enjoyed your presentation. Early on, you were talking about trying to differentiate the effects of affirmative action, and that it would be difficult to do with the sample you had because you were focusing on SCSTs. What about running a comparison with the OBCs as well, those that you can identify?
Well, actually, one of the things I wanted to talk about, but I didn't get it. I'm glad you asked me the question about assessing affirmative action, because Professor Weisskopf, who's sitting here, he and I have done actually the first of its kind study looking at the productivity impact of affirmative action. So we've analyzed the data from Indian Railways and tried to estimate productivity and tried to see whether affirmative action, which is just having quotas for SCST, results. The claim is that it will result in lower productivity, right? Because you're taking people with quote unquote lower merit, and we in fact find through a very very rigorous empirical econometric estimation, we actually find no evidence of lower productivity. So that's the first study of its kind that we've completed. So I'm advertising our study, Tom.
Very quick question.
Yes.
The discrimination against Muslims, is that something new after the independence, or is it Like during the British administration, was there a discrimination too for civil servant jobs or not?
The discrimination during the British times was a little bit different because Indians, there was an issue of Indians versus British, right? And so, for example, in the Indian civil service, Indians were not allowed to proceed beyond a certain level. So the top positions were had to be occupied by the British. So the issue is not as much between Hindus and Muslims within Indians, but really the question of Indians versus British versus Indians. So
Still, they have to have some occupations filled by the native population, correct?
yeah, but it's very difficult to determine what was within because there were so many groups, and what you understand today as India actually came into being as a result of the British rule in the sense of various territories getting annexed, etc. So that's a much more complex issue. But the British did recognize caste-based discrimination, and so the policy of quotas, having quotas for the untouchable castes, actually started during the British time. So certain parts of India had quotas which the British had started. So it was just continued after after independence. Yes.
I was just going to get back to the question you asked at the beginning, which was to see whether this labor market discrimination is past discrimination or something new. And
no, not new. What I wanted to say was, does it continue it to even today? It's not new, but it's
okay. Not continue. Not new, but in the sense that if you factor in the pre-market discrimination and then you're looking at the labor market discrimination, what I wasn't very sure is whether in that survey that you did with the students, whether it was also divided around caste or was it also class? So the family background question could be read in both ways, right? So a second generation Dalit, what they call the creamy layer, would have a very different response than, say, somebody from a rural, poorer background. So how do we know that is a caste discrimination versus something else?
No, you can't. I mean, you can't totally tell that you're absolutely right. What the family background question gets at is not only caste. It gets at it's a complex of caste, class, religion. It's a whole bunch of things that they're trying to get at. But caste is an important factor in that. So all we are saying is that employers, so despite the fact that they claim to be concerned only about merit, what we find through our work is that they are concerned, the way they view merit is defined along all of these lines. So yeah, we cannot, from this survey, we cannot disentangle caste versus religion. You're absolutely right. But what it shows is that they are very aware of these social identities which are not supposed to matter for jobs of this kind. On paper, they don't matter, right? On paper, it doesn't matter whether as long as you have the educational background. And many of these students, I've been my own student at the Delhi school. And, we just interviewing them differentially. I mean, for example, one boy was interviewed for Citibank or one of these, big banking firms in Bombay. And so he was flown to Bombay for the interview. And he's told me that the minute I walked into the interview board, I knew I was getting the job. They said, oh, hello, etc. And so he was made to sit and they said, oh, the nightlife. And so they didn't ask him any question. The only thing they were telling him was about how great the nightlife in Bombay is and how he's going to have a great time. Yeah, and that he should really move from Delhi to Bombay because Bombay is a rocking city and all the rest of it. Now, the fact is, he said the minute I went in, I knew I had the job. And this wasn't fixed. It wasn't like he had asked somebody to get, he was just, because of who he was, I mean, just his credentials were impeccable. I mean, his family background in all ways, class, caste, everything, gender, everything matched what the employers wanted. And so they did not ask him any question about what he had studied at the Delhi school, nothing. He was surprised. But he said, I knew I was getting the job. Very confident. Yes.
Thank you for your talk. You mentioned that the cream basically thinks that the other class, the other class is actually privileged because they have the benefit of quote-unquote affirmative action. And that's a pretty big issue here in the United States right now, too. I remember in third grade, my elementary school teacher emphasized, in fact, idealistically, it's not who you know, it's what you know, merit. Then by the time I got here at U of M and even in grad school now, both undergrad and graduate school, there are a lot of professors say it is who you know. make connections, make networking, doing everything. They even do this during orientation. So, a more realistic view perhaps. But my question is this: if it's true that so many actually thought that they were privileged because they could take benefit of affirmative action.
No, this is the view of the upper caste about
Right,
Dalits.
right.
They believe that they were privileged.
Right.
The Dalits were privileged.
Right.
Yes.
Is that a cultural thing in India that there's, you said overwhelmingly, so I was thinking that maybe they have a negative belief about affirmative action in the sense that they actually think that simply because you benefited from affirmative action that you are advantaged to
Yes.
their disadvantage.
That's true. That is absolutely correct. But it's not, again, this finding is not unique to India. There have been other studies of affirmative action, including in the United States, where those who don't get affirmative action feel that they are disprivileged because, it's the cause and effect is totally inverted. So affirmative action is supposed to compensate for historical discrimination, right, or contemporary discrimination, whatever. But they believe that actually affirmative action bestows privileges on groups that get affirmative action. And this is not a finding, we found that in our study, but it's not a finding unique to India at all.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Amit, yeah.
First, I think this is absolutely fabulous work. I really, really enjoyed this, and I've, two things occurred to me. One is, so I want to sort of, the question is about the pre-market treatment, like before these kids are actually going onto the market. I mean, how do we tease out the effects of the pre-market treatment? I mean, you put students through that kind of experience, right? And I'm talking about Dalit students systematically. You're basically shattering their confidence, right? So, and by the time they land on the job market, they're primed for failure, right? How do we tease that out from what's actually happening at the interview, right? That's one. The second question, which occurred to me based on my experience in JNU, is this: that the way affirmative action actually plays out is that among the among sort of general seats, a lot of, let's say, the upper caste, urban upper caste, are predisposed or in sort of well equipped to sort of compete, right? There are large numbers. The upper caste are, we know that for a fact that their numbers that they tend to be in urban areas. They have access to resources. So they sort of so the seats get filled by urban upper caste. But when you start looking at the seats which are sort of quota seats, because we just don't have the numbers in urban areas, those seats actually go to people who are coming from small towns and rural areas, where provision of education is bad for everybody, irrespective. So I'm just saying, how do we tease out the rural-urban effects, right? Which are sort of, because the urban castes, the upper castes have moved to urban areas in larger numbers. It's actually not so much. So there's a sort of conflation of both the caste and the sort of rural-urban effects. How do we tease those?
Right. So that's a part that I didn't talk about at all, actually. So we do, in fact, have an entire section on that. And you're right that JNU actually has many more of those kinds of students who come from very poor rural families. And Delhi University, where I teach, you don't find those many. So, for example, the sample included my own students at the Delhi school. And we don't really have students from rural backgrounds at all because of the requirements of our course. It's highly mathematical. You have to be good at maths and English to be able to do an MA in economics at the Delhi school. And so that already restricts the... so yes, that is absolutely right. And in certain contexts, for example, the JNU. But we also find that studying in JNU actually manages to restore a lot of the shattered confidence that you talked about. In the sense that they feel that if they hadn't got this education, there was absolutely no chance. Many of them said, my option in my village was to do this, but now that I've got a job in JNU, I can actually think of these other possible jobs. All right. So actually what I didn't talk about also was the baseline questionnaire results. And we found a clear difference in what they felt was the job they realistically expected to find. So already at the level when they were not even in the job market yet, their aspirations were differentially, because so the Dalits, when you track the jobs that they expected to find, were already lower level jobs. as compared to the non-Dalits. So even with the same degree, they knew that their chances in the labor. So they had kind of internalized the possibility that they would face discrimination or they would not be as confident or whatever. And for example, in Delhi school where I teach, many of the Dalit students, we have a placement cell, which routes students to go towards corporate jobs. So many of the scheduled caste students don't enroll for the placement cell at all, because their point is, what's the point? We'll just not be able to talk so fluently. We don't wear nice enough clothes. We don't look savvy enough, etc. So many of them don't sign up for the placement cell. So their point is, why go through this entire process when we know? So this is the expectation of discrimination already. You opt out of the market completely. That doesn't even get captured here, because these are people only who are in the labor market. So if you opt out on the expectation of discrimination, that is also some evidence. But anyway, so there was all of that in the paper, but I wasn't able to talk about that.
Well, thank you very much.
Oh.